For those of you in attendance, thank you. My name's Sam Brigham. I'm a director over here at Realm.Security. I'm joined by.
I'm Devon. I'm the head of product here at Realm.
All right, so look, we're a security data pipeline company that focuses on optimizing data for today and preparing for whatever the SOC looks like tomorrow. Today, we're going to hone in and focus on addressing something that we're hearing kind of ring loud in the market, which is cutting SIM costs without cutting coverage. So when we look at, what's driving up costs, we've kind of bucketed it into three categories, and I think this is going to resonate with anybody in attendance, right? But first and foremost, we look at data growth, just a large volume and abundance of data. Look like new and existing technologies entering your security stack. With that comes valuable data sets and more data and more driving the need for monitoring and logging. Um, then we talk about kind of ingest pricing. I like to think about this a little bit beyond that and think about it as just really like cost associated with data, because beyond just an ingest pricing model, there's other costs associated with it around the data, things like, in certain systems, different credit systems, cost of compute, data retention, all falls into this category. And when you combine it all, can get quite pricey. And then lastly, we look at fear of cutting. And let's be clear, right? I think there's certainly companies out there collecting what they've decided to be their key signals. But with that, they're sacrificing other sources because of budget constraints. This is certainly a challenge because they essentially need to say no to certain data sets and make decisions on what to keep and what to exclude. But more commonly, we see companies over collecting out of fear of missing something. And what happens then is they're prioritizing their budget cycles to account for their SIM spend.
Uh, just to tack on to kind of this fear of cutting, I think there's a clear difference between data that is available and ultimately data that is actionable. And that's where kind of when we think about what data earns its keep versus low signal to noise style data sets. And I think when you really cut down to the core of it, you start to think about the problem of, why is it when I ingest a new source that I have to blindly accept whatever that source decides to send? I think that's, any vendor product really cares about the product that they send to their customers, and their focus on logs and exporting logs is minimal because for them, they can just cover the bases by saying, let's include everything. Let's go as verbose as possible. Let's go as noisy as possible so that they can at least say we've covered our bases on the activity within the platform. And I think from when you think about a SOC, it's not necessarily tied to how the SOC uses the data. And that's really a foundational problem in cyber today is the difference between vendor products and how a SOC would operate. I think as we kind of dig into some of the other usual kind of problems here and kind of getting into the details of what we have here, we have the usual culprits of what people would typically find, and that is, the real goal, which is to focus on what matters. And really, at the end of the day, when you think of workflows in the SIM, sometimes noise is just noise, and there is relevant workflows within the SOC that may need different types of data. But at the end of the day, when you think of a SIM, the SIM is focused on detection and correlation of that data set. So if you think about different types of examples, one would be, let's think about a firewall. There's many, many different types of firewall logs that can get through from firewall data. And there's use cases why you would maybe need that. For one use case, most SOC teams really send the end starts of the end pieces of traffic logs. And when you focus on maybe going into say workflows of trying to figure out and determine, hey, what's wrong with this firewall or what's wrong with this piece, you might include the start traffic and it might become relevant for that specific data source. But why would it just be sitting there gathering dust in the SIM for a typical workflow that you'd be working through from an IT use case? So there's a lot of different types of things where we can identify the waste there, and that's really where we can think about cutting the problem.
Yeah, so I mean, this opens up the discussion ultimately on like what we're seeing in the market and how customers are trying to solve for this today. Just understand that there's these decisions being made, and each one has its own unique consequence. right? So you can start with the do nothing. We see that. Keep paying the premium or collecting a leaner data set, wishing you were consuming more. On the infrastructure pipeline side, we see this as well. See that as being fairly powerful, complex, but ultimately hard to manage. Um, in their core, built for IT. And as a security team, right, you're giving up ownership and control of important data. And then we move over to the SIM bundled tools. This one's interesting because I think that's just like a very popular sentiment in the market about just being over indexed on SIM already. So like I think vendor lock is appropriate to bring up here. Taking this approach, you're continuing to invest in what an already owned tool. So this actually goes beyond vendor lock and starts getting into overall strategy lock. And then lastly, there's the build it yourself. We do bump into this here and there in the market, but we see very few companies having the resources, time, and budget to do it effectively. And even if successful, which we do see success in this endeavor, but then it starts coming down to who's in charge of it, what happens if something breaks, who's responsible for that, or what team, and on hours, off hours, etc. Cost of ownership really does come into play, and then the conversation around like, does it actually work, and does it work today? Oftentimes it can, but then is it extensible enough to adapt to your future strategies? So over here at Realm, we genuinely think the market needs a pipeline that asks you to give up nothing. So today our goal is to talk about how Realm can effectively cut your costs at your SIM and do so without impacting detections.
Awesome. And when we really think about this, I mean, at the core of the pipeline, it is that you can cut volume. And then the question becomes, well, which volume and how do I do that? And the most common hurdle from a customer, when the SOC trying to build out that tactical strategy is really just not being an expert on every log item or, exported file that's being ingested into the SIM today. And most folks don't know the fields and they don't know the vendor's purpose. So they have to go back and forth between different teams and organizations to figure out exactly what the schema is and how they can start picking and choosing. And that's when we'll go through to the next items to really kind of talk through on, how maybe customers may do this today and what we could look like in the future of really giving up that cadence for the SOC. So when we think about what customers can do today, working through a manual process is how do we try to make sure that we're not reducing, the actual data that we need to use and utilize our analytics tools downstream. So typically when teams are building out this structure and the strategy internally, they're trying to determine what logs are in their keep in our environment. And they may ask these three questions. There might be additional ones that folks may ask, but if you can typically think about it as a top level strategy, first one, what does an active detection depend on? And this is across, maybe it's across products or it's across product styles or, different types of vendors. And this is essentially asking, is there specific log types that I'm ingesting from this vendor that I'm genuinely relying on for my saved queries and saved responses that I have within my SIM? So that leads us to the next question is, well, when something does happen, are these data sets used for response in investigation? So for active detection and then active response. And how do we try to ensure that this is not going to be a gap when our teams run into it? Then the third part is focused on slightly different use cases, but it still is relevant to think about when you're earning the problem, because at the end of the day, when you do have the ability to slice and dice the data that goes between sources and destinations, being able to think about, well, it may not be used for this use case in the SIM, but it may be used for other use cases like an audit or compliance. Some folks may be sending that also to the SIM. So there is that type of connection and connective tissue that we need to ask those questions. And for each of these asks across this could be across terabytes of data per day, and this could be a massive time sunk. If you think about every log source that you may be ingesting could have different event types and different schemas and different formats that we would have to genuinely understand in order to translate that from detection and response queries back to the actual formatting of data being sent from a solution. So when we think about this, we're really trying to focus on that problem, which is if it takes so much time and effort to really build out that type of strategy, what can we use AI to do in order to build out that defensible reduction strategy that we want to do? So here at Realm, we're focused on automating the processes that are the hardest to do within the SOC and the SOC process that would be the least identifiable as a security use case. So when we think about data plumbing, it's really meant to organize the data and understand it for how you're going to be using it. So if we think about defensible reduction, let's focus on solving those three questions we talked above, but using that in a more automated process. So Realm is building it out in a three automated stage process. The first one is when we ingest the source, we're building the composition of that data set. And then we ingest the detections that are used in the SIEM to translate that also to a compositional structure. So we're mapping the data to what it would look like in a log format. We're associating that with the MITRE tactics that would be available for that, and ultimately kind of building up what are the dependencies necessary for this detection to run, and can we organize that based off of the schemas and the structure of the data that's flowing through the pipeline itself. That's stage one. Stage two is when we actually want to start to make the translation, which is once we start to understand that data set, now we have to make that make sense in Realm and make that make sense in the pipeline. So what that turns out to being is essentially all these varying formats and query languages that are represented in the SIEM or in those destinations. If you have a separate detection engine, we have to bring that vendor syntax into the Realm pipeline and translate that so that you don't have to do this yourself on those varying formats across the different types of schemas. And that leads us to the last problem, which is now that we've done the categorization and we've done the translation, what happens? So what happens is we'll present recommendations for the shape of what that data should look like to make sure that the detection workflows are totally unappended or unimpeded. And at the same time, we're ultimately being able to present the what is the actual findings that are associated with the logs that are protected. So if we can look at how much data are we needing to say is immutable and has to move through to the SIEM? Is it 25%? Is it 30%? Is it 40%? Is that must have, must not touch data set? We can present those as structural exclusion rules so that the customer can ultimately affect and say, hey, this thing is a thumbs up, let's send this downstream. But at the same time, if you're writing rules or if you're building these strategies out yourself, we also want to present this as hey, there's an effect here that may be necessary for you to choose what type of data that you need to send to trigger this detection rule. So these types of overlapping, recommendations from exclusions to findings are really where this process starts to build into a recursive structure. And ultimately, what that is focused on is being able to build out the strategy for a customer to be able to cut volumes of noise and be able to have to prove that downstream with confidence. So be a little bit more aggressive, be a little bit more fine-tuned with your presentations back to your other team members, and giving the confidence to say that this isn't actually going to impact the way we use our SIEM or analytics tool downstream. So tracking that actual coverage with confidence, and then ultimately being able to focus on the security of the job rather than the data plumbing. So that validation that we're running for the data set as it flows through the pipes.
All right. So, I mean, as we round home here, let's just look at a great example of Realm in production. This is a global manufacturer, 36,000 employees. This was is one of the largest Microsoft Sentinel deployments in the world. This was competitive. Over a span of time, we ran a 3-month bake-off against other pipeline vendors, and ultimately Realm was selected. And during testing, right, we effectively were able to replace more than 1,000 KQL rules in DCR logic while reducing 50% of their Palo Alto firewall logs. This was done in a very short amount of time. This was a 72-hour time frame where we were able to accomplish this. And then ultimately, they're found a massive ROI. Realm returns $3 for every dollar spent on Sentinel. Beyond some of the other players in the space being competitive, some of the, call it legacy pipeline players were involved too. For the other respective vendors, the deployment effort was a heavy lift, didn't justify the value, and Realm was chosen at the end for ease of deployment, ease of use, and reduction effectiveness. Now, look, our goal here at Realm is to just ultimately prove this to you. Devon covered off on some of our tact and logic on how we apply this into production environments. But it's very easy to do, right? We encourage folks that have tuned in or listened to this later on to give us the opportunity to do so. And it can be as simple as selecting one source. Or in your case, it could be, multiple sources. It doesn't matter. We are confident in providing a meaningful reduction in value to your organization in as short as 7 days, and that's from start to finish. So as it relates to, our presentation, that's what we had prepared today. So we're going to open this up for some questions, and Devin and I will do some Q&A. Let me just jockey some screens. All right, we've got a couple questions flowing in. All right, question one here, starting at the top. My detections constantly change. If I cut something today, how does it hold up as my rules change?
Yeah, I can take that one, Sam. I mean, at the end of the day, like environments change and they need to change. And that's the beauty of Realm. Realm is an AI system built for this. It's built for change, built for adaptation. And when we think about adding changes and distribution changes over time for whether it's detections or flow data changes, those can easily be added to the contextual layer of what Realm uses to update our logic and strategies internally and ultimately to the customer. So when I think about this, it's really just how do we make this faster for a customer, making them not have to start at square one again. You don't have to answer the same questions that you did last time because all this is a change to your existing flow that we already have. So that context is key. So when rules change, we can ultimately make those updates as time flows, and we'll present different types of strategies based on the data flow. If you change vendors, you change detections, that stuff can be recursively added to our strategies that we present to the customer.
All right. Next question. What happens when I need data I've already cut, say 6 months later for an investigation? I mean, I feel like I can take that one. Devin, feel free to fill in any blanks, but ultimately Realm has a data haven. Realm's data haven is a searchable retention layer of the platform. We keep an immutable raw copy of all of your security data, normalized on OCSF, attached to each event. So if you need it, you can actually search your full history directly and resupply those exact events that you might need for investigation at your destination. Did I miss
Yeah,
anything there, Devin?
no, I think that's great. I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest problems with historical data in the past has been that it's icy, it's cold, it sits in some place that is hard to get to, or it's behind a couple of indexes that you have to kind of chew through. So um, for us, it's really about making that available and usable for the use case that it's used for. And that's, when you talk about OCSF normalization and trying to build things up into observables, it's really about how do we focus in the needle in the haystack style investigation for a, beyond 90-day style search. And this is primarily one to save people compute costs and ultimately define the right data when they need it at time.
All right. Looks like we've got time for a couple more. This one I'm going to dole over to Devin, but given you're handling our security data, what do you have access to, and what does adding Realm mean for our risk posture?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, for us, we've isolated every customer tenant. Everybody has their own independent data flow, data tenant, data plane that is isolated from other customers, so it doesn't sit in this melting pot. And then the Realm recommendation system is focused on metadata and the distribution of fields. As I was talking before, like that's how you're building out the composition of those data fields anyway. And at the end of this process, it becomes that, what are you ending up training this model on? And the big question here and answer is that no customer data is used in our training. And you shouldn't be thinking about it in that format. We're really using it as a structural component for the recommendation. And that's, full stop. We're not using it.
All right, I think we've got time for another one. Once this is in place, who's operating it today? Is it on my analysts to manage, or is it managed for us?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't touch on the whole product, but at the end of the day, I mean, Realm is we're trying to present a tool that is low touch, low friction, and that could seem like it would be managed, right? If you think about data sets as it flows through, we think that security data should work for a customer, which I mean, in the past it hasn't. So it's been a lot of user interruption or user kind of influence into the service itself. And I mean, we're designed to take away the grunt work, take away the toil of maintaining a flow of data or ingest pipeline or parsing pipeline or even just the routing strategy that you have overall. So from that side, you could definitely feel like we would be a managed solution. But with that said, at the outset of preparing and supplying the strategy to the data as it flows through the pipes, it's ultimately on the human. We want this to be executed by the SOC, executed by a strategy that SOC feels confident in, that they can ultimately say, hey, we were the ones that decided that this was the right strategy for us. We'll present everything in clean format to make it simple, but at the end of the day, we want the human in the loop to ultimately make choices on what changes in production data.
All right. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks, Devon, for joining. Always great to be on the panel with you. We appreciate your time and insights. Also like to just say thank you to everybody who attended today's session. And then also to those in the future who may elect to listen to the recording in their free time. I'd like to wish everybody a great afternoon. And if you're headed to Black Hat this weekend, I'd like to wish you safe travels.